Story number 1.
Every February 14th for as long as I can remember, I'd been avoiding Valentine's Day. It wasn't that I had anything against it. I didn't care for the over-commercialized nature of it all, but this day always stirred up memories I wished would stay buried. Memories of my sister, Rose. I'll start by telling you about Rose. She was 3 years older than me, full of life and laughter, the type of person who could light up a room. On Valentine's Day, it was no different. Rose was always excited for it, even as a child. She used to insist on giving me handmade Valentine cards, telling me it was a special day for everyone, even those who were alone. It was a running joke in our family that Rose would always find a way to make the day special for all of us, no matter our age. But that all changed 2 years ago. It was on Valentine's Day when she left for a short road trip to visit some old friends. She never came back. I still remember the phone call. The voice on the other end told me there had been an accident. Her car had gone off the road in a snowy stretch of highway. No one could explain what had happened, but there had been no signs of foul play. She was just gone. It broke me. Rose had always been there for me, through thick and thin. She was more than just a sister. She was my best friend. So after that tragic day, I never wanted to celebrate Valentine's Day again. The memories were too painful. I buried myself in work, keeping my distance from the world on that day. But last year, something changed. I don't know what it was, but I found myself drawn to the idea of going back to our childhood home. Maybe it was my way of confronting the ghosts of that day. Maybe I thought I could finally move on. The house was in a small town out in the country, a quaint little place that, on the surface, looked unremarkable. I hadn't been there since Rose's passing. The thought of stepping into her room, walking through the spaces we used to share, made my stomach churn. But I felt I had to. I didn't want to live in fear of memories any longer. I packed my bag, bracing myself for the emotional whirlwind. I arrived on the 14th, the snow falling lightly as I made my way up the familiar path to the front door. The house felt just the same, quiet, still, and strangely welcoming. As I stepped inside, the scent of wood and dust filled my nose. It had been months since anyone had lived here. Still, something about the place felt different, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something. I walked through the room slowly, taking it all in. I finally made my way upstairs to Rose's old bedroom. Her scent still lingered in the air. Her things were still there, the same posters on the walls, her favorite books stacked neatly on a shelf. Nothing had been touched. It wasn't until I sat down on the edge of her bed that I noticed the card. There, sitting on her nightstand, was a Valentine's card. It wasn't one of the usual ones she had always given me, with glitter and hearts, but it was unmistakably hers. I picked it up carefully, my hands trembling. The front of the card was simple, 2 intertwined hearts. Inside it was written in Rose's handwriting, "You'll always be my Valentine. I'll never leave you." A lump formed in my throat. It was as if she were still here, talking to me. But that didn't make sense. Rose was gone. I couldn't let myself get lost in these memories. Yet, as I stood there in her room, the house seemed to grow colder, and a shiver ran down my spine. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the isolation. I opened the window, letting the cold air blow in, hoping it would clear my mind. As I stood there, staring out at the snowy landscape, I thought I heard something. A faint sound, like footsteps. I spun around, heart racing. The room was empty, but something was wrong. The air felt charged, and I could feel it in the pit of my stomach. I closed the window, but the uneasy feeling stayed. The floorboards creaked behind me, and I turned, expecting to see someone there. But there was no one. Still, the footsteps persisted, growing louder now, echoing through the old house. I could hear them outside the door, then down the hall. It was unmistakable. Someone was walking through the house. I stood frozen, too afraid to move, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Was it my mind playing tricks on me? Had I imagined the card, the footsteps, everything? No. Something was here, something I couldn't explain. Then suddenly I heard the soft sound of a door opening, followed by a faint whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like Rose's voice. It was so clear, so real. I could have sworn it was her. I ran out of the room, calling out her name. Rose? Nothing. The silence that followed was deafening. I wandered through the house, searching every room, but there was no one there. Yet, The coldness remained. It wasn't just the chill of winter. It was something deeper, something older, a presence that couldn't be ignored. I made my way back to the living room where a single candle flickered on the coffee table. I hadn't lit it, but there it was, glowing softly in the darkness. I stared at the flame, trying to gather my thoughts, and that's when I heard it again, a voice, clear and unmistakable, calling my name. Emily. My heart skipped a beat. This time, I knew it wasn't my imagination. I wasn't alone. I bolted from the living room, rushing outside and into the freezing night. The snow stung my face, and the cold bit into my skin, but I didn't care. I couldn't stay in that house, not with whatever was there. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, and even then, I didn't look back. When I finally got home, I sat there shaking, trying to process everything that had happened. Had I really heard Rose's voice? Was it a ghost, or was it just my grief manifesting itself in a way I couldn't understand? The card on her nightstand, the footsteps, the whispers, they couldn't all be explained away. I don't know what it was, but I do know one thing. I'll never return to that house again. Whatever was there, it wasn't Rose. It was something else, something that had taken hold of the place. And as I sit here now 2 years later, I can't help but feel like I'm still being watched. Like Rose is still out there, her spirit lingering in that house, waiting for me to come back. But I won't. Not ever again. Story the end.
Story number 2.
It was supposed to be a simple getaway for Valentine's Day. A chance to get away from the hustle of everyday life, to relax, to reconnect. The small cabin I had rented was tucked away in a wooded area, far from the distractions of the city. It was charming. Just the kind of place I envisioned for a peaceful retreat with my partner, Sarah. The snow had been falling heavily that morning as we drove up to the cabin. The world around us was blanketed in a thick coat of white. We arrived to find the cabin just as described in the listing. Rustic and cozy, with a large stone fireplace, wooden beams, and soft lighting. It was the perfect place to spend a quiet evening together, far from anyone else. As the sun began to set, we settled in, enjoying a simple dinner of pasta and wine, laughing and chatting about our plans for the future. The night was cold, but the warmth of the fire kept the cabin comfortable. We sat on the couch, enjoying each other's company when we heard it. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, the creaks and groans of an old wooden building in the cold. But then I heard it again, a faint tapping on the window. I glanced at Sarah, unsure if she had heard it too. Her expression told me she had. The wind had picked up, and the snow was falling harder, so at first, I thought it might just be the storm. But the tapping continued, persistent and rhythmic. Probably just branches against the window, I said, trying to brush it off. The wind's making everything rattle. Sarah didn't seem convinced. It doesn't sound like branches. It's too deliberate. I shrugged it off and stood up to check. I walked to the window, pulling aside the curtain to peer into the snowstorm outside. There was nothing there. No branches, no animals, no other signs of life. Just the darkened woods and the swirling snow. The tapping stopped as soon as I looked. See? Nothing, I said with a small laugh, but I could feel a strange unease creeping up on me. We went back to the couch, but the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. There was a tension in the air that I couldn't explain. The fire crackled loudly in the hearth, but the cabin felt colder now, despite the warmth radiating from the flames. As we sat there trying to shake off the weird feeling, I noticed something strange in the reflection of the window. A shadow. A dark, moving figure outside, just beyond the light of the porch. It was hard to make out, but it was unmistakably there, moving slowly through the snow. I stood up again, my heart racing now. "Did you see that?" I asked Sarah, my voice tight. She nodded, her face pale. "I saw it too." I stepped outside, determined to see what it was, but as soon as I opened the door, the cold hit me like a wall. I stepped out onto the porch, scanning the area, but there was nothing. No footprints in the snow, no sign of anyone or anything, just the howling wind and the swirling snowflakes. I was about to turn back when I heard it again. This time it wasn't a tap on the window, but a soft whisper, just barely audible, carried by the wind. The sound came from behind me, from deep in the woods. "Help me." It was a voice, faint but clear, a woman's voice. My blood ran cold. It wasn't Sarah, and it wasn't anyone I knew. I turned around quickly, looking toward the source of the sound, but there was no one in sight. "Sarah!" I called out, my voice trembling. I hurried back inside, slamming the door behind me. We need to leave. Now. Sarah was standing near the window, her face as pale as I felt. What happened? What did you hear? There's something out there, I said, my heart pounding. Someone is out there in the woods. I grabbed my phone to call the local authorities, but the signal was gone. My stomach dropped as I realized we were completely cut off. I walked over to the fireplace and stoked the fire, trying to calm myself, but the unease only deepened. Every noise in the house seemed amplified. The crackling of the fire, the howling wind outside, and the occasional sound of footsteps that seemed to echo through the walls. Sarah sat down, shaking her head. Maybe we're just spooked from the storm. It's easy to imagine things when you're isolated. I wanted to believe that, but something in the air felt wrong. The temperature had dropped further, and the house seemed to groan with each gust of wind. We tried to sleep, but sleep didn't come. The wind howled louder, and the strange tapping resumed, now on the door. Soft, persistent, like someone was waiting to be let in. I held my breath, straining to hear over the wind, but the tapping wasn't random. It was rhythmic again, as if someone was trying to communicate. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the storm playing tricks on us, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone in the cabin. At some point, I must have drifted off to sleep, but I woke up with a start. The room was completely dark now, the fire nearly out, and the house felt freezing. I could hear Sarah's breath coming fast and shallow beside me, and I reached over to reassure her, but I froze when my fingers brushed against her arm. It was icy cold. Too cold. "Sarah?" I whispered, but she didn't respond. I shook her gently, but she remained completely still. My panic grew as I tried to rouse her, but she wouldn't wake up. Then I heard it again. The whisper. Clearer this time, right next to my ear. "Help me." The voice was chilling, too familiar. It was the same voice I had heard earlier, and it was right behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. There was only the silence of the cabin and Sarah's cold, unmoving body beside me. Suddenly, I saw it. A figure, a shadow moving just beyond the edge of the room. It was fleeting, but I could tell it was human. A woman, her face obscured, her outline barely visible. The figure moved slowly, almost gliding, and the air seemed to grow colder with each passing second. I scrambled out of bed, grabbing my phone again, but there was still no signal. The figure appeared again, this time closer. Its presence was suffocating. I tried to yell, to scream, but no sound came from my mouth. The figure was drawing nearer, and I felt my chest tighten with fear. I ran toward the door, dragging Sarah with me, but before I could reach it, the whisper came again, loud and clear. "Don't leave me." And then everything went black. When I woke up, I was alone in the cabin. The fire had gone out completely, and the snowstorm had stopped. The cabin was eerily silent, but the temperature had returned to normal. Sarah was gone. I searched the entire cabin, every room, every closet. I looked outside, hoping to find some sign of her, but there was nothing. Just the deep, untouched snow and the quiet woods. The only trace of her was a Valentine's Day card she had left on the bed. It read, "I'll love you always, forever." I don't know what happened that night. I don't know if it was a ghost or if it was just my mind playing tricks, but Sarah was gone. And every year on Valentine's Day, I can still hear that whisper in the wind. Help me. Story the end.
Story number 3.
Every year, I look forward to Valentine's Day. It's not just because of the flowers or the dinner reservations. It's because it's the day I met Lily. We'd been together for 5 years, and every February 14th, we'd reminisce about how we met that night at a little bookstore cafe. It was our tradition. But this year felt different. I could feel it the moment I woke up. The air seemed heavier, and the house, despite the warmth of the heater, felt too cold. It's hard to explain, but it was as though something was wrong. Still, I brushed it off and got ready for our special night. Lily and I were set to meet for dinner at our favorite spot, a small restaurant by the lake. The night was clear, and the stars above seemed to shine just a little brighter than usual. As I drove to pick her up, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had been lingering all day. When I pulled up to her apartment, I noticed the lights were off. That wasn't unusual. She often liked to sit in the dark before going out. I rang the doorbell, and after a moment, the door creaked open. But Lily wasn't standing there. Instead, there was a note on the floor, folded neatly. I bent down and unfolded it, my heart racing as I read the words, "I'll always be with you. Forever." Confused, I looked around, thinking maybe she was playing some sort of prank, but there was no sign of her. I called her phone, but it went straight to voicemail. I stepped inside, calling her name softly, but the apartment was empty. The eerie silence made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I went through every room, turning on the lights, hoping I'd find her. But there was no trace of Lily. I was about to call the police when I noticed something strange. On the coffee table, there was a picture of us, the one we had taken at that bookstore cafe all those years ago. The one with Lily's bright smile and my arm around her shoulder. But the picture was different now. In the photo, Lily's smile was gone. Her face was pale and her eyes seemed hollow, almost as if she wasn't there at all. I stared at it, my pulse quickening as I tried to make sense of it. I turned the picture over and there, written on the back in neat handwriting, were two words, "Help me." My mind was spinning. I didn't know what to do. I had to find her, but where could she have gone? The feeling of dread that had been with me all day intensified. I raced out of her apartment and back to my car, driving aimlessly, my thoughts a blur. I had to find her. I don't remember how I ended up at the old park, the one where Lily and I used to walk after our dates. It was quiet and empty that night, the moon casting an eerie glow over the empty swings. I stopped the car and got out, my breath visible in the cold air. I couldn't explain it, but I felt drawn here. As I walked deeper into the park, something strange happened. The sound of the wind seemed to die down, and the world around me felt unnervingly still. Then, just beyond the old gazebo, I saw a figure standing in the shadows. At first I thought it was Lily, but as I approached, I realized the figure was too tall, too thin. And then I saw it clearly. Her face was twisted into something unrecognizable, her eyes wide and hollow like the ones in the photograph. "Lily?" I whispered, my voice shaking. The figure didn't respond, but it began to move toward me, gliding across the ground like it wasn't walking at all. The closer it came, the more I could see its features. Gaunt skin, lips pulled tight into a grimace, and eyes that seemed to stare straight through me. My body froze. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. The figure reached out toward me with an outstretched hand, its fingers long and unnaturally bent. And then it spoke. "I'm sorry," it said, its voice not Lily's, but something much darker. "But I can't leave." Suddenly, everything snapped into focus. My mind screamed at me, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It was impossible, but I knew the truth. This wasn't Lily. This was something else, something that had taken her. I turned to run, but before I could move, I felt an icy grip on my arm, pulling me back. The cold was unbearable, as though the very air around me had frozen. I turned, facing the creature, but it wasn't just a figure anymore. It was Lily, or at least it looked like her. Her once beautiful face was now contorted in agony, her lips stretched into a painful smile. "I'm sorry," she repeated, her voice hollow. "I'm sorry I had to leave you, but I had no choice." The last of my strength left me, and I stumbled back, unable to look away from her. The figure stepped forward, and as it did, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. Its chest, once flat, was now visibly moving. There was something inside, something alive. The realization hit me like a brick. Lily hadn't just disappeared, she had been taken, and whatever was standing in front of me now was no longer her. With a sudden, sharp movement, the creature lunged at me. I felt the sharp sting of cold air as its fingers wrapped around my neck, tightening with unnatural strength. I gasped, struggling to breathe as the figure pulled me closer, its face inching toward mine. "You shouldn't have come," it whispered, its breath cold against my skin. "You should have let me go." I couldn't fight it. I couldn't breathe. My vision started to fade as darkness crept in, and just before everything went black, I heard a soft, familiar voice. "Help me." It was Lily's voice, but it wasn't her. It was a cry for help. I reached out, my body trembling, desperate to save her, but it was too late. When I woke up, I was lying on the cold, damp ground near the gazebo. The park was silent, empty, as though nothing had happened at all. I sat up, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no sign of the creature, no sign of Lily, just the eerie quiet of the park, as though I had imagined it all. But I knew I hadn't. I don't know what happened that night. I don't know if it was a ghost, a demon, or something else entirely. But I do know that something took Lily from me, and every year since then on Valentine's Day, I hear her voice calling out from the darkness, "Help me." Story, the end.
Story number 4.
It was a cold February evening, just a few days before Valentine's Day, and I found myself on a small rural road winding through the dense woods that led to the old house. I had never been this way before, but the invitation from a family friend had been clear. Come to the house. It's been a while since we had a visit. Plus, I've got something I think you'll want to see. I was a bit wary but intrigued, and the promise of seeing something old, perhaps a piece of family history, had piqued my curiosity. The house, when I finally arrived, stood on the edge of the forest like a forgotten relic. It was a large, decaying structure with peeling paint and windows that seemed to be watching you. The porch sagged under the weight of years, and the path leading to it was overgrown with weeds. Despite its state of disrepair, there was something strangely welcoming about it, as if the house, despite its age, had seen something worth remembering. I knocked on the door and waited. A moment later, it creaked open to reveal the face of Nora, the family friend. She was in her mid-40s, a bit older than I remembered, but her smile still had the warmth it always had. Come in, she said, stepping aside to let me in. Her voice was thick with something I couldn't place, a slight unease. The air inside was cool, and the scent of wood and dust hung heavily in the house. She led me through a narrow hallway to a large room at the back where an old fireplace crackled and a couple of lamps provided a soft glow. The house felt alive in a way I hadn't expected, as if every corner held a story. Here's what I wanted to show you, Nora said, gesturing to a large wooden chest sitting in the center of the room. It was covered with a faded cloth, and as she pulled it back, the sound of old fabric rustling echoed in the room. Inside the chest was an assortment of objects, most of them cloth or tucked into boxes. But what caught my eye was a small, delicate locket sitting on top of everything. It was old-fashioned, made of tarnished silver with a faded photograph inside. That belonged to my grandmother, Nora said, her voice dropping. It was a gift from her first love. But there's something you should know. It's said to have brought misfortune to those who wore it. I felt a chill run down my spine, but Nora's expression was soft. She didn't seem scared, just troubled. It was given to her on Valentine's Day, and she kept it close for the rest of her life. But after she wore it, things began to happen. Her fiancé vanished without a trace, and from that day, the family had a string of unfortunate events. My grandmother always swore that the locket was cursed. I chuckled nervously. Come on, a cursed locket? That's a bit much, don't you think? Nora's eyes darkened. I used to think so too, but then after my grandmother passed away, I found this. She pulled out a small, yellowed letter from the chest and handed it to me. The letter was dated February 14th, 1943. It was a love letter, the handwriting beautiful, but the words chilling. I will always be yours, even if the world should burn around us. I promised to love you for eternity, and that promise will never fade, even if the heavens themselves try to tear us apart. But beware, my darling, for the path we walk is cursed, and I will never return if you wear this. Keep it close to your heart, but don't let it claim you like it claimed me. Do you believe it? I asked, more out of politeness than genuine curiosity. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something in the air had changed. Nora hesitated before responding. I used to think it was just an old superstition, but after everything that happened to my family, I don't know. It seems like a warning, a real one. There was a long silence between us as I studied the letter. The weight of its words was heavy, unsettling. I wanted to dismiss it, but something about the house, about the air, made me uneasy. You said it claimed someone? I asked. Nora nodded, her face pale. My grandmother's fiancé, Thomas. He vanished shortly after he gave her the locket. No one ever saw him again. Some say he left, but others... She trailed off, her voice trembling. Others say he was taken. I glanced at the locket again, feeling a coldness wrap around me. It was small and innocuous, yet there was something about it, something about the way it seemed to pull at the air around it. I didn't want to believe in curses. I didn't. But the longer I stood there, the more I wondered if I had made a mistake coming here, if there was more to the story than I could see. Nora broke the silence. I know you probably think it's all just an old story, but I've been hearing things around here lately. Odd noises at night, whispers in the walls, things out of place, and then last week I found the locket again. My heart skipped a beat. You mean it wasn't here before? No, she replied. I hadn't seen it in years. I thought it was gone, but then one night I found it on my bed, just like that. I could see she was rattled, and her eyes weren't focused on me anymore. She was looking past me, staring at something invisible. The fire crackled in the hearth, but the room felt colder somehow. Suddenly there was a loud creak, like a door slowly opening. I turned quickly, but there was nothing, no one there. I looked at Nora, who had gone completely still. Her eyes were wide, staring at the doorway across the room. Nora? I asked, my voice quiet, uncertain. She didn't respond. She was frozen, her expression filled with something I couldn't name. I felt my heart beat faster as I turned to follow her gaze. There, in the dim light, I saw it. A shadow. Not a normal shadow, but a dark shape that seemed to float just above the floor. It was as if it had materialized from the corner of the room, creeping along the wall, moving slowly toward us. I couldn't breathe. My body locked up with terror as I watched the shadow inch closer. I opened my mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Do you see that? Nora whispered, her voice trembling. It's back. Before I could say anything, the shadow lunged forward, disappearing into the space between us. I felt a cold gust of wind whip through the room, and the fire sputtered as though it had been snuffed out. Get out! Nora screamed, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward the door. Her face was pale, tears welling up in her eyes. It's here. It's not just a story. It's real. We ran through the house, stumbling over the old furniture as the air grew colder with every step. Behind us, I could hear whispers, faint and ghostly, calling our names. But the house was dark, and the only thing I could focus on was the heavy thud of my own heartbeat. I didn't stop until we were outside, standing on the porch, the bitter cold of the February night cutting through my clothes. The wind howled around us, but the whispering had stopped. I turned to Nora, who was trembling. What was that? What the hell was that thing? Nora shook her head, tears streaking down her face. It's Thomas. It's his spirit. He's been searching for the locket ever since he disappeared. The curse isn't just a story. It's real, and now he wants it back. We didn't speak as we left, the house looming behind us, its windows dark and unwelcoming. I don't know what happened that night. I don't know what we saw, but I do know this. I will never forget the coldness of that room, the shadows in the corners, and the feeling that something ancient and angry was waiting. And now, every Valentine's Day, I hear whispers in the dark. Story, the end.
Story number 5.
I'd never been a big fan of Valentine's Day. The overblown expectations, the forced celebrations, it all seemed so artificial. But I had recently started dating someone, Sarah, and after a couple of weeks of getting to know each other, she invited me to spend the evening with her. It seemed harmless enough, just dinner, maybe a movie, nothing extravagant. Little did I know that this would be the night that would change everything. We met at her apartment, a cozy one-bedroom in a quiet part of the city. The walls were lined with bookshelves, and the soft glow of lamps gave the place a warm, inviting feel. Sarah was a kind soul. Her laughter was contagious, and she had this way of making me feel at ease, like I'd known her for years. As I entered, the first thing I noticed was a single red rose on the kitchen counter, its petals delicate and fresh. "Happy Valentine's Day," she said with a smile. "I know we said we wouldn't make a big deal of it, but I thought I'd get you something small." I chuckled and handed her a card, explaining that I hadn't been able to find anything particularly romantic, so I'd settled for a simple gesture. We shared a quiet laugh over it and then sat down to eat dinner. The conversation was easy, filled with the usual back and forth about our lives and thoughts on everything from books to movies. After dinner, we settled on watching a film. Sarah put in a movie I hadn't heard of, something about a haunted house. It seemed appropriate for a night like this, but I wasn't expecting it to be anything that would leave an impression on me. As the movie played, I felt a chill in the room, not from the film, but from something else. It was subtle at first, like a faint shiver running across the back of my neck. The house was old. I knew that much. Sarah had mentioned a few times that it creaked and groaned with the wind, but tonight it felt different. It was the sound of something scraping against the walls, like fingernails dragging down the surface. At first I thought it was just the house settling, but then the scraping sound repeated, more deliberate this time. I glanced at Sarah, who seemed unbothered, her focus fixed on the screen. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice low. Sarah didn't respond at first, but then her eyes shifted toward the hallway, where the noise had come from. She hesitated and then nodded. "Yeah, I've heard that before," she said softly. "It's probably just the house. It does that sometimes." I wasn't convinced. The sound had a strange rhythm to it, almost like it was trying to get our attention. I stood up, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. "I'm going to check it out." Sarah didn't stop me, but she did look a little unsettled. I walked toward the hallway, my footsteps careful, as though I didn't want to disturb whatever was in the shadows. The noise grew louder as I approached the door to her bedroom. I pushed it open, and the room was completely still. Nothing seemed out of place, but the air felt thicker, colder. I couldn't explain it, but it was like the room was holding its breath, waiting for something. As I stepped back into the hallway, the scraping noise abruptly stopped. I shook my head, thinking it was just an old house. Maybe the wind had changed direction or the heating system was acting up. But something felt off, like there was an invisible presence lingering in the air. I returned to the living room and sank back into the couch, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. "Everything okay?" Sarah asked, her voice quieter now. "Yeah, I just checked it out. Probably nothing. It's just an old house, right?" I replied, but even as I said the words, I wasn't entirely sure I believed them. The movie ended shortly after, and we decided to call it a night. Sarah offered me a drink, but I declined, not wanting to overstay my welcome. As I stood to leave, she gave me a smile and walked me to the door. "Thanks for coming over," she said. "I'm really glad we did this." "Me too," I replied with a smile, though the uneasy feeling still lingered in my chest. There was something about tonight that didn't sit right with me, and I couldn't shake it. I stepped out into the hallway, my shoes clicking softly on the wooden floor. As I reached for the door handle, something caught my eye. A shadow, just at the edge of the doorframe, like someone was standing there. But when I turned to look, there was nothing. I froze, the hair on the back of my neck prickling as I felt an overwhelming chill flood over me. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw the rose from earlier, the one Sarah had placed on the counter, sitting on the floor just inside the door. It wasn't there before. I turned back to Sarah, who was still standing in the living room, her back turned to me. "Hey, the rose," I started, but then I stopped myself. Sarah hadn't moved. Before I could say anything else, the temperature in the room dropped. My breath became visible in the air, a thick mist swirling around my chest. I watched as Sarah's figure suddenly seemed to waver, her outline blurring like a mirage. Then the air around me grew heavy, the presence of something unseen pressing against me. I felt a suffocating dread, and then I heard it, a voice. Not Sarah's, but soft, distant, and hollow. It whispered my name. "Come back." I spun around, my heart racing. But Sarah was still standing there, completely still, her eyes fixed on some point I couldn't see. Her lips moved, but the words that came out of her mouth weren't hers. The voice sounded far older, colder. "Come back. To me," it whispered again, and the air grew colder still. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. What was happening? Was I losing my mind? Sarah didn't seem to notice anything strange, her face locked in a peaceful expression as if nothing was wrong. "Sarah!" I shouted, my voice sharp with panic. "What the hell is going on?" She blinked, her eyes clearing as if she had just snapped out of a trance. "What's wrong?" she asked, confused. The temperature in the room returned to normal, the air no longer thick with an unnatural presence. I couldn't speak. I could only stare at her, trying to process what had just happened. I had no explanation for it. No reason why her voice had changed or why the room had grown so cold so suddenly. "I have to go. I have to go," I said. I turned to leave, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that something or someone was watching me. As I reached the door, I turned back to see Sarah standing there, her gaze fixed on me with an intensity I couldn't explain. Her lips parted, and in a voice that was almost a whisper, she said, "I'll see you soon." I left her apartment without looking back, my pulse racing the entire way down the stairs. When I got into my car, I noticed that my reflection in the rearview mirror was different, blurred, like a shadow that didn't belong. I tried to brush it off as fatigue, but the nagging feeling of being watched lingered as I drove home. The next day, I couldn't bring myself to call Sarah. The events of the previous night weighed heavily on me, and as the days passed, the feeling of unease only grew. I couldn't shake the sensation that something had followed me from her apartment, something tied to her and the house. I never saw Sarah again. I tried to contact her several times after that night, but all my attempts were met with silence. Eventually, I found out that she had moved. No forwarding address, no explanation. She vanished from my life as quickly as she had come into it. I never forgot that night, and to this day, I still don't know what happened. But every year on Valentine's Day, I feel the same cold presence and hear the same whisper. Come back. Story the end.
Story number 5.
I never believed in ghosts. I always thought they were the stuff of folklore and superstition, something people use to explain things they didn't understand. That changed on Valentine's Day 5 years ago. At the time, I was living in a small town in upstate New York, working as a freelance photographer. My girlfriend, Emily, and I had been together for 2 years, and Valentine's Day was never a big deal for us. We liked simple things, cooking dinner together, watching old horror movies, and enjoying each other's company. That year, Emily had a different idea. There's this old restaurant just outside town, she told me a week before. The Rosewood Inn. It's supposed to be one of the most romantic places around. Candlelit tables, violin music, the whole deal. I had heard of it before. A historic inn turned restaurant built in the early 1900s. It had a reputation for being charming, if a bit eerie. The kind of place where people whispered about haunted hallways and strange noises in the night. But Emily was excited, and I wasn't about to spoil that for her. The night of Valentine's Day, we arrived at the Rosewood Inn just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The building stood tall, its once white exterior now faded and cracked. A large iron gate surrounded the property, and the leafless trees lining the driveway cast long, skeletal shadows in the moonlight. Inside, the atmosphere was warm but quiet. The restaurant was only half full, the kind of place that seemed frozen in time. A heavy chandelier hung from the ceiling, its flickering bulbs casting golden light over deep red wallpaper. There were framed black and white photographs on the walls. Old couples, families, people who had dined here long before us. A waiter led us to a small table by the window where candlelight danced across our plates. The dinner was nice. Good wine, soft music, the kind of night you'd want to remember. But something felt off. At first, it was just small things. A sudden draft despite no open windows. The sensation of someone watching us from across the room, though every time I looked, there was no one there. I kept brushing it off, telling myself it was just the history of the place playing tricks on me. Then Emily's expression changed. She was staring past me toward the far end of the dining room. Her face had gone pale, her lips slightly parted. "Are you okay?" I asked. She didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "There was a woman," she said, "standing by the fireplace. I turned to look, but the space was empty, just the flickering flames casting moving shadows along the brick." I frowned. "What did she look like?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. Emily hesitated. She was wearing a long dress, something old-fashioned, and she was just staring at us. A chill ran down my spine, but I forced a smile. "It's probably just your imagination. This place has that kind of vibe." Emily didn't look convinced, but she nodded, and we continued with our meal. Still, the uneasiness lingered. Halfway through dinner, I excused myself to use the restroom. The hallway leading there was dimly lit, lined with more old photos. As I walked, I felt an overwhelming sense of being watched. The hair on my arms stood up, and I quickened my pace. Then I saw her, a woman standing at the end of the hallway. She was dressed in a flowing white gown, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders. Her face was pale, almost too pale, and her eyes, dark and hollow, locked onto mine. My breath caught in my throat. I blinked. She was gone. A cold sweat broke out across my skin. I turned and hurried back to the table, my mind racing. Emily looked up as I sat down. "You saw her," she said softly. I nodded. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. Then, as if on cue, the candle on our table flickered violently before going out completely. That was it. We paid the check as fast as possible and left the Rosewood Inn without looking back. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her, the woman in white, her hollow stare drilling into me. At one point, I woke up gasping for air, feeling an unbearable weight pressing down on my chest as if someone was sitting on me. The next morning, I decided to do some research on the Rosewood Inn. What I found sent shivers down my spine. Decades ago, a woman named Margaret Holloway had been a regular guest at the inn. She had been engaged to a man who was known to be unfaithful. On Valentine's Day in 1923, he had promised to meet her for dinner at the inn. She waited for hours, but he never showed. Heartbroken and humiliated, she left the restaurant, walked to the second-floor balcony, and stepped off the edge. She died instantly. Since then, people have claimed to see her ghost wandering the hallways, appearing to couples on Valentine's Day, the day she had been abandoned. Neither Emily nor I ever went back to the Rosewood Inn. I never told her about what I had found, but I think she knew. We broke up a few months later for reasons unrelated to that night, but I always wondered if she still thought about it. I know I do. Every Valentine's Day since then, I've had the same dream. I'm sitting at that table across from Emily, but when I look up, Emily is gone, and Margaret Holloway is sitting in her place, smiling. Story the end.
Story number 6.
It was Valentine's Day, and I had plans to meet my best friend, Sarah, for a quiet dinner at the restaurant she had been raving about for weeks. We'd known each other since high school, and though we had drifted apart a little in recent years, this was our chance to reconnect. Both of us had recently come out of long-term relationships, so we figured it would be good to have a night to ourselves. No romantic distractions and just two friends supporting each other through the mess of heartbreak. The restaurant was charming, located in a historic part of town with old brick walls, a soft glow from antique chandeliers, and small tables scattered throughout. It was the perfect setting for a romantic evening, but we were just there to enjoy each other's company. The air was thick with the smell of fresh flowers, chocolate, and candle wax, and the place had a cozy, intimate vibe. It felt nice to be there, away from the chaos of our personal lives. But the night took an unexpected turn. I arrived first, and while I waited for Sarah, I found myself people-watching, enjoying the warmth of the place. As I sat by the window, I noticed an older woman sitting alone at a table near the back. She was dressed in a long, dark coat with a scarf wrapped tightly around her neck. Her hair was silver, and she had a calm, almost eerie presence. She was staring out the window, but her gaze wasn't focused on anything in particular. It was as though she was lost in thought, staring into something only she could see. I didn't think much of it at the time. It wasn't uncommon to see people dining alone on Valentine's Day, though it always felt a bit sad. But when Sarah arrived, she mentioned something that made me shiver. "Did you notice the woman sitting by herself in the back?" she asked. Sitting down across from me, I nodded. "Yeah, I saw her when I walked in. She looked kind of out of place." Sarah hesitated before speaking again. "There's something weird about her. She's been here every time I've come to this restaurant, always sitting alone, always staring out the window, and every time I see her, she seems, well, a little sad, like she's waiting for someone." I didn't know how to respond. The idea that someone would come to a restaurant every day, alone, and never change their routine seemed strange, but I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. We both ordered drinks and started talking, but I couldn't shake the image of that woman sitting alone, her vacant eyes still lingering in my mind. The evening passed quietly, and we caught up on everything: work, family, our failed relationships. But every now and then, my eyes would wander back to the woman in the corner. She hadn't moved, hadn't even shifted in her seat. It was as if she was frozen in time. Finally, after dinner, we decided to leave. As we walked toward the door, I glanced over at the woman again. To my surprise, she was no longer sitting at her table. In fact, there was no sign of her at all. The chair was empty. The table was set for a new customer, but she had vanished. "Where did she go?" I asked, glancing at Sarah. "I don't know," Sarah replied, frowning. "She was just there a second ago." We both looked around the room, but there was no sign of the older woman. The restaurant wasn't large, and we had seen her clearly from our table. She couldn't have left so quickly, not without anyone noticing. But there was no trace of her anywhere. We shrugged it off as a weird coincidence and left the restaurant, heading down the street toward the parking lot. The air was cold, the kind of cold that makes you feel like winter is just beginning, even though it's nearing spring. As we walked, Sarah suddenly stopped and turned to me, her face pale. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her eyes darting around. I stopped, confused. "I swear I heard something," Sarah said, her voice trembling, like footsteps behind us. I strained my ears, but all I could hear was the sound of our footsteps on the pavement. "Sarah, there's no one back there. You're just being paranoid." But as I turned back to keep walking, I noticed something strange. In the reflection of the window on the restaurant's door, I could see the silhouette of the older woman. She was standing outside, just beyond the threshold of the door, staring at us. Her face was eerily pale, and she wasn't moving, just standing there, watching us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her away, urging her to hurry. "What the hell was that?" Sarah whispered, her voice shaky. "I don't know," I replied, my heart racing. "But we're getting out of here." We quickly made our way to my car, both of us glancing nervously over our shoulders. As we drove away, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the woman following us, but there was nothing. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept replaying the woman's face in my mind, her cold, lifeless stare, and I couldn't stop thinking about how she had disappeared so suddenly. It didn't make sense, and it unsettled me more than I cared to admit. A few days later, Sarah called me. "You won't believe this," she said, her voice anxious. "I did some digging on that restaurant, and the woman we saw, her name was Margaret." I listened as Sarah continued. "Apparently, she used to come to that restaurant every Valentine's Day without fail. She would sit at the same table by the window and order a glass of wine. She always waited for someone, but she never said who. The strange part is that Margaret hasn't been seen in years. The people who worked there said she died in a car accident on Valentine's Day right outside the restaurant years ago. She was on her way to meet someone, but she never made it." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Wait, are you saying she's a ghost?" I think so," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's the only explanation, and the weirdest part, people say that every Valentine's Day she comes back to the restaurant, sits at the same table, and waits. She's waiting for someone, and she never leaves." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It didn't make sense, but everything about that night, the cold, the eerie atmosphere, the strange disappearance, seemed to line up. I didn't know what to think, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we had somehow encountered something beyond the realm of explanation. That Valentine's Day remains one of the strangest, most unsettling nights of my life. I haven't been back to that restaurant, and I don't think I ever will. But every year, when Valentine's Day rolls around, I can't help but think of Margaret, the woman who waited in vain for a love that would never return. Story, the end.
Story number 8.
I had never thought of Valentine's Day as anything more than a holiday to celebrate love, or for some to endure loneliness. But that all changed during my first year living in the old house on the hill. The house had been in my family for generations, and while it had a charming rustic feel on the outside, there was something about it that never quite felt welcoming. The creaky floors, the narrow hallways, the overgrown garden that had a tendency to give off an eerie feeling whenever I walked through it. There were enough oddities that made me question my decision to move in. Still, it was mine now, and I figured it was time to make a new life there. It was the evening of February 14th when I first started noticing something wasn't quite right. I had spent the day alone, something I had become accustomed to in my adult life. Valentine's Day had always been bittersweet, half of me longing for the romantic gestures I'd seen in movies, and the other half determined not to let it get to me. After all, I had this old house to keep me company. Around dusk, I decided to go for a walk in the woods behind the house, something I liked to do when I felt restless. The trees were bare, their branches scraping against the sky like skeletal fingers. The ground was frozen, with patches of snow clinging to the earth. As I walked deeper into the woods, the silence around me seemed to grow thicker. I stopped for a moment, listening to the quiet. There was no wind, no birds calling, just an overwhelming stillness. Then, just as I was about to turn back, I heard it, a soft, almost inaudible voice. "Come back." It wasn't my imagination. I had definitely heard it. I turned quickly, scanning the area around me, but there was no one in sight. The trees were thick, and the shadows seemed to grow darker by the second. I thought perhaps I was hearing things, my mind playing tricks on me, but the voice was clear, like a whisper right behind my ear. A shiver ran down my spine. Maybe I should head back to the house. I turned to walk toward the path, but then I heard the voice again, this time louder, more insistent. "Come back to me." This time I froze. It wasn't just a voice, it was a presence, something heavy that seemed to envelop the woods. My heart started pounding in my chest, and I turned around to see nothing. Just the trees, stretching endlessly into the horizon. No figure, no person, just the eerie, oppressive quiet that filled the space. Shaken, I quickly made my way back to the house, the sensation of being watched creeping over me the entire time. As I entered the house, I immediately felt the temperature drop. It wasn't cold outside, just the typical winter chill, but inside it was as though the air had become heavier. The lights flickered above me, casting unsettling shadows against the walls. I shrugged it off as an old house being temperamental, but something about it felt off. I went to the kitchen to grab a cup of tea, trying to calm my nerves. The house was quiet, too quiet. The soft ticking of the clock on the wall seemed to echo in the silence. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone. That's when I noticed the first thing, the envelope on the counter. It was a simple white envelope with no return address. My name was written on the front in elegant handwriting. I felt a chill run down my spine as I picked it up, but curiosity got the best of me. I opened it slowly, my fingers trembling, and pulled out the card inside. It was a Valentine's Day card, but it wasn't like the usual ones I had seen. This one was old-fashioned, with intricate lace edges and a faded picture of a couple in a garden, their faces nearly indistinguishable. Inside, there was a message written in the same elegant handwriting. "I will always love you, even in death. Meet me where we first met, and we will never be apart." A wave of nausea hit me. Who was this? I didn't recognize the handwriting, and I certainly hadn't met anyone recently who would send me a card like this. I couldn't stop thinking about it as I set the card down. The words felt ominous, the mention of death unnerving, but still, I dismissed it as a prank or a mistake. Perhaps someone had sent it to the wrong address. But as the night wore on, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The house seemed to groan with every gust of wind, the floors creaking as though footsteps were echoing in the hallways. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid, but the unease wouldn't leave. I decided to go to bed early, hoping sleep would give me some relief from the creeping dread. But as soon as I turned off the lights and pulled the covers over me, I heard it again. A soft whisper. "Come back." I bolted upright in bed, my heart racing. The whisper was so clear, so real, that I could almost feel the breath on my skin. I immediately looked around the room, but it was empty. There was no one there. I tried to calm myself, but the house was alive with sounds. The floorboards creaked, the wind howled outside, and the whispering voice seemed to come from every direction. My eyes darted around the room, landing on the corner where the shadows seemed to shift. It was there, something or someone standing just out of view, too far for me to see clearly, but close enough for me to feel their presence. "Who are you?" I called out, my voice trembling. But there was no answer. The air grew colder still, and the whispering only grew louder. Then, as if in response to my question, I saw it. A figure, pale and faint, standing at the foot of my bed. Its form was almost translucent, but I could make out the outline of a man, tall, with dark hair and a tattered suit. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, and he was staring directly at me. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to move, but my body wouldn't respond. I was frozen in place, unable to tear my eyes away from the figure before me. "Come back," he whispered again, his voice cold and filled with sorrow. And then, as suddenly as it appeared, the figure vanished, leaving only the sound of my rapid breathing and the faint, lingering sense of dread in the room. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I spent the rest of the hours staring at the dark corners of the room, listening to the whispering voices that seemed to fill the house, coming from places I couldn't see. The next morning, I didn't dare tell anyone what had happened. Who would believe me? It sounded too insane, even to my own ears. But later, when I went down to the cellar to gather some old things I had forgotten about, I found something that made my blood run cold. A faded photograph, crinkled at the edges, with a couple standing in front of the house. The woman's face was familiar, and my stomach churned as I realized who she was, my grandmother, and the man beside her was the figure from my room. I didn't know who he was, but the words from the card echoed in my mind. I will always love you, even in death. The whispers came back every Valentine's Day after that. They still do, and every year the presence grows closer. I can't escape it, and every time I try, I hear his voice, faint but clear. Come back. Story the end.
Story number 9.
It was the night before Valentine's Day, and I was preparing to head to bed early, hoping to get a good night's sleep before meeting my boyfriend, Andy, the next day. He and I had been dating for about a year, and I had made plans for us to spend the day together at a cozy little cabin in the woods to escape the city. It had been a while since we'd had a proper weekend to ourselves, and I was looking forward to some quiet time away from everything. But that night, I found myself restless. As the clock struck 10 p.m., I still hadn't drifted off. My mind was racing with all the little details about our trip, and I kept thinking about how the day had gone by so quickly. It was late, and the world outside my apartment was still, the city sounds muffled by the falling snow. But then, something unusual happened. There was a knock on the door. I wasn't expecting anyone. Andy had texted me earlier to confirm our plans for tomorrow, and my neighbors were usually quiet at this hour. The knock came again, followed by a soft shuffling noise. I stood still for a moment, wondering if I was imagining things. Maybe it was the wind. But the knock was deliberate, rhythmic, almost too human to ignore. I walked to the door slowly, peeking through the peephole. To my surprise, there was no one in sight. I opened the door cautiously, feeling a chill in the air even though I had the heater running. There was no one standing in the hallway, just the stillness of the apartment building. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine, but I shrugged it off and closed the door. I tried to forget about the knock, chalking it up to my imagination or the wind. But then, just as I started to settle back into bed, there was another knock. This time, more urgent. I froze, feeling a cold sweat break out along the back of my neck. My heart began to pound. I grabbed my phone to text Andy, but before I could, my screen lit up with a new message. It was from Andy, but it didn't make sense. Hey, I need to tell you something. Don't go to the cabin tomorrow. Please don't go. I'm sorry. Confused, I read the message again, but there was no follow-up. I immediately called him, but the call went straight to voicemail. Panic started to set in. I texted back, but there was no response. At that moment, the knock came again, this time accompanied by a soft voice. Please, don't go. I stood frozen in my apartment, my mind racing. What the hell was going on? The voice didn't sound like Andy, and it didn't sound like anyone I recognized. I felt sick to my stomach, like I was being watched. The hallway outside my door remained empty. I felt a tug of dread in the pit of my stomach. It got the better of me. I opened the door just enough to peek out, but there was nothing, just the quiet hum of the building. I felt a rush of cold air sweep through the doorframe, but it was gone as soon as I stepped back into my apartment. The night dragged on in an uncomfortable stillness. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't stop thinking about the knocks, the voice, and the text from Andy. Something didn't feel right. I kept checking my phone, waiting for him to call, but no calls came. I tried reaching out to my friends for some comfort, but no one was available. I was alone with my thoughts and the overwhelming feeling that something had shifted, that something was wrong. At 3 a.m., just as I was about to give up and try to get some sleep, my phone rang. I immediately grabbed it, expecting it to be Andy. Instead, it was an unknown number. Hesitant, I answered. Hello? Don't go to the cabin tomorrow, the voice on the other end whispered. It was low and hoarse, almost as if it had been distorted. It wasn't Andy's voice, but there was something oddly familiar about it. I felt a surge of fear. Who is this? What do you want? There was a long pause. Then the voice spoke again, slower this time, almost like it was trying to reach into my soul. You're not supposed to be there. He's waiting for you. The line went dead. I tried to call the number back, but it was disconnected. I was shaking, my heart pounding in my chest. I don't know why, but I immediately thought of the cabin. There was something about it, a heaviness that always hung over it. Andy had rented it from a website for secluded getaways, but I'd never really asked many questions about it. The way the voice had mentioned he made my skin crawl. Who was waiting for me? I felt a sudden urge to go there, to the cabin, despite everything. It was as though I couldn't resist it, like some invisible force was pulling me in. But that didn't make sense. I was terrified. Something wasn't right, but I couldn't figure out what. I lay back down, hoping sleep would give me some clarity, but the dreams were relentless. I found myself in the woods, alone. The trees were bare and the ground was frozen solid. A thick fog had settled in and I couldn't see anything in front of me, but I could feel him. A man's presence, watching from the shadows. I couldn't move. My body was frozen, my breath shallow. Then I saw a figure in the distance, an outline of a man standing near a cabin. I recognized the cabin. It was the one Andy had rented. But the man, his face obscured, was calling to me. His voice was soft but full of an unholy urgency. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I screamed, but no sound escaped. He was getting closer. I woke up in a cold sweat, gasping for air. It took me a moment to realize I was back in my apartment, and it was morning. Valentine's Day. I immediately checked my phone for messages, but there was still no word from Andy. My mind was racing. The dreams felt too real. I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to go to the cabin and figure out what was going on. Something told me that I had to. I packed a bag quickly, throwing in the essentials. I had to leave, had to confront whatever it was that was calling me to that place. As I drove toward the cabin, the snow grew thicker. The landscape turned quieter, more desolate. It was like the world was closing in around me. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was setting, casting a dim orange glow over the white expanse. I parked the car and stepped out, feeling the crunch of snow beneath my feet. The cabin stood there, dark and still. I approached cautiously. The door creaked open on its own as I reached for the handle. Inside, everything was exactly as I remembered from the photos Andy had shown me. Rustic, cozy, with a crackling fireplace. But something was wrong. The air felt too cold. I felt a presence watching me from the shadows. "Andy?" I called out, but my voice trembled. There was no answer. But then I heard it, a low murmur, almost like a whisper. "Leave. Leave now." My blood ran cold. The voice. It was the same one from the phone call, the same one from the knocks. I turned to flee, but as I reached the door, it slammed shut on its own, trapping me inside. Panic surged through me. I was locked in. The fireplace flickered out, and in the sudden darkness, I heard footsteps. Soft, deliberate. They were coming closer. The figure emerged from the corner, slowly stepping into the dim light. It was the man from my dream, the one who had been waiting for me. His face was twisted in a grim smile, his eyes hollow and black. "You shouldn't have come," he said, his voice hoarse. I screamed. The door flew open, and I ran, not looking back until I reached the car. The cabin loomed behind me, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I never found out who the man was or why he was haunting that place, but I left that cabin and never returned. To this day, I have no idea how Andy knew about the place, or why I heard his voice during that call. The only thing I know for certain is that I'm never going near that cabin again. Not for any reason. Story the end.
Story number 10.
We were three friends, all in our late 20s, and we decided to take a break from our busy lives and go winter camping in the mountains. It had been a long year, and we all needed some time away to reconnect and relax. Our destination was a small, remote campsite deep in the woods, far from the noise of the city. We had been there once before during the summer, and it was one of the most peaceful places we had ever been. It felt like the perfect spot to escape to for a weekend getaway. The drive up to the campsite took longer than expected. The snow was thick and the road was icy in some places. But we had a four-wheel drive vehicle, so we felt confident that we would make it. When we finally arrived, the sun was starting to set, casting a pinkish hue over the snow-covered trees. The campsite was eerily quiet and the air felt colder than usual. We unloaded our gear and set up the tent, the only shelter in sight, surrounded by miles of snow-covered wilderness. That evening, we made a fire and sat around it, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. We were in high spirits, laughing and enjoying the crackling warmth of the fire. But as the night grew darker, a strange feeling began to settle in. The forest around us seemed unnaturally still, as if the trees were holding their breath. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, though I couldn't pinpoint why. My friends didn't seem to notice it, so I pushed the thought aside and focused on the fire. Later, after the fire had burned down to embers, we climbed into the tent to sleep. The wind howled outside and the snow continued to fall steadily, muffling all sounds. I tossed and turned, unable to sleep. The cold air inside the tent made it hard to get comfortable, and the feeling of unease still lingered. The sound of the wind was unsettling, but it was the quiet moments between gusts that made me feel as though there was something waiting. I couldn't shake the sense that something was out there in the woods, watching us. Around midnight, I finally drifted off, only to be awakened by the sound of movement outside the tent. I lay still, listening intently. It wasn't the wind, nor was it an animal. The sound was deliberate, slow, and heavy, like someone or something was walking just outside the tent. My heart began to race as I strained to hear any further sounds. My friends were still asleep, completely unaware of the noise. I grabbed my flashlight, careful not to wake anyone, and unzipped the tent just a crack to peek outside. There was nothing. The snow was still falling and everything seemed peaceful. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding and zipped the tent back up. But as soon as I lay back down, the sound came again. A slow, methodical step crunching on the snow right outside the tent. I sat up quickly and nudged my friend Jake. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Jake groggily turned over. "Hear what?" I hesitated. "Someone's outside the tent. I swear I heard footsteps." Jake sat up, now more alert. He listened for a moment, but then shrugged. "It's probably just an animal. You know how it gets out here." I wasn't so sure. There was something about the footsteps that felt intentional. They weren't the erratic movements of a wild animal. They sounded like someone or something was pacing, watching us. We decided to wait it out for a while, listening carefully. The footsteps continued for a few more minutes, but then just as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. The silence that followed was even more unsettling. After what felt like an eternity, we finally decided to check outside, just to be sure nothing was amiss. We stepped out into the cold, our breath visible in the night air. The campfire had burned down to nothing, leaving only the faint glow of the embers. There were no footprints in the snow around the tent, no sign of anyone having been there. Everything was undisturbed. I felt a sense of relief, but also a strange confusion. How could we have heard footsteps if there was no one out there? Jake and I returned to the tent, but neither of us could sleep after that. We lay awake for hours, our minds racing with thoughts of what could have caused the noises. I was certain there was something out there, but what? The next morning, we decided to hike up to a nearby ridge to get a better view of the surrounding area. The forest was beautiful, with snow-covered trees and the stillness that only winter could bring. But as we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I felt a presence lurking just behind us, like someone was following at a distance. It was impossible to shake off, and it seemed to intensify the farther we hiked. We made our way up to the ridge, and when we reached the top, we were met with a breathtaking view. The entire valley below us was covered in a thick blanket of snow, and the distant mountains seemed to stretch on forever. It was peaceful, but I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing just out of sight. That afternoon, we returned to the campsite, but as we neared the tent, we noticed something strange. The area around the campsite was undisturbed. No new tracks in the snow, no signs of movement. But as we reached the tent, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The door of the tent was slightly unzipped, just enough for someone or something to peek inside. I called out to my friends, but no one was inside. The tent was completely empty, and the sleeping bags were undisturbed. We frantically searched the campsite, calling out for our friends, but there was no answer. The silence that hung in the air was suffocating. After what felt like hours of searching, we finally found their backpacks, but there was no sign of them. They had simply disappeared. Panic set in. We were in the middle of nowhere and the weather was worsening. A storm was rolling in, and the temperature was dropping fast. We had no choice but to try to find shelter and wait for help, but there was no cell service, no way to contact anyone. We huddled together, trying to stay warm, but the dread I felt was overwhelming. It was as if something was waiting for us in the darkness, something that had already claimed our friends. We spent the next several hours trying to survive the cold and stay alert. The sounds of the forest had changed. There was an eerie stillness, broken only by the howling wind. But as the night fell again, the footsteps returned. This time, we were not alone. Shadows moved in the snow just beyond our camp, and the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps echoed through the trees. We stayed as quiet as possible, hearts pounding, waiting for whatever was out there to approach. But it didn't. The footsteps circled our camp, then retreated into the darkness. We didn't sleep that night. At dawn, we decided to leave the campsite and head back down the mountain, hoping we could find some sign of our missing friends. As we hiked down, we found more strange things: broken branches, disturbed snow, and eerie marks in the trees, as though something had been dragging itself through the forest. We eventually made it to a ranger station at the base of the mountain, where we contacted the authorities. A search was launched, but despite several days of looking, no trace of our friends was ever found. It was as though they had vanished into thin air. The rangers said they had never encountered anything like it. There were no signs of a struggle, no tracks leading away from the campsite, nothing. It was as if the forest had swallowed them whole. Afterward, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been out there in the woods was still watching, still waiting. I haven't gone back to that mountain, and I don't think I ever will. The memories of that night still haunt me, and I can't help but wonder if we were just unlucky, or if there was something more to the forest than we ever understood. Story the end.